Right, so hear me out. Scaring kids is, generally speaking, a good thing. Now, of course, scaring kids is funny, hilarious even, but that's not what I mean. The world is a terrifying place, full of terrifying things. War, disease, emotional trauma, various societal isms. Realizing you spent 4 years of your life studying media in defiance of conventional wisdom, only to graduate into a dormant industry and watch your savings wither away while you pray to unknown gods for so much as a day gig driving a cargo van full of cameras to Vegas and back. Horror in children's media serves a very specific and unique purpose, and if you're ahead of the text, you'll probably know it's to introduce children to the scaries of the real world in a way that they can easily understand. Also, as a bonus, it keeps Hot Topic staffed. But to understand how children's horror operates on a narrative level and why it maintains its appeal long past childhood for so many people, we need to do more than think about what kids are afraid of. We need to look at the space between children's and adult horror. In a sense, teenaged horror. Not horror for teens, but like a conceptuality of horror that is caught between the mindsets of the two demographics, making it metaphorically teenaged. Confused, disoriented, anxious, and deeply afraid of itself. And also it wears a lot of Hot Topic stuff. Ponder with me this query. What is Animorphs but Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis with big 90s energy? Sure, there's aliens and stuff, but there's no such thing as a perfect analogy. Now, nobody really knows exactly what Kafka was getting at with his seminal story of a man waking up one day as some kind of bug thing, but it doesn't matter because what I'm really getting at here is body horror. I don't have any footage of conventional body horror because I want to maintain the relative kid-friendliness of this video, and also it creeps me out a lot and I don't like it. But the main function of body horror is more than just to be gross. It's to express the inherent horror of physicality and the anxiety that revolves around having and being a very fragile and exposed body. Children's horror often conveys the stress of inhabiting a developing body at a time of life where being different is, well, more frightening than usual. Let's start simple. The body swap. Growing into an adult body is a terrifying thing for most kids, and the freedom and responsibility implied by becoming an adult provides an easy gateway for emotional growth. Have the likes of Freaky Friday and, I don't know, pick a body swap episode from any list of kids shows provided us with instant classics? No, it's kind of a weak premise, but displacement of the body is a common theme in children's media, and one that creates horror for children who are generally uncomfortable enough already in their own bodies. When talented people take these concepts and evolve them, you get a wide range of stories that run with children's body horror to tell bigger stories about making peace with who you are. Much like how Get Out is, in a certain sense, an exercise in body horror, so is the early work of Tim Burton. The opening sequence of Edward Scissorhands introduces an almost dark fantasy setting and then immediately drags you into a sickening pastel version of suburbia. It's creepy how perfect this world is, and it makes Edward look all the more ridiculous, as he's practically othered into submission and fawned over by bored rich people like some kind of exotic pet. Of course, as soon as he steps out of line, the pitchforks come out, metaphorically speaking, and everyone knew it all along, they swear. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The necessity of fitting in is a universal fear with a wide variety of connotations, but Burton's early parallels, like Edward as Frankenstein's monster, encapsulated a childlike understanding of what is now called social horror without talking down to kids, and without ever losing sight of what makes being turned into a pariah truly terrifying. Invader Zim took an opposite stance, putting a relatively normal hero into a grotesque and practically uninhabitable world. The influences from similarly paranoid horror classics are immediately recognizable, but Invader Zim used a satirical version of Earth to put a darkly comedic spin on the trouble kids have getting adults to believe them. Like in the similarly underappreciated Courage the Cowardly Dog, Dib's paranoia as a protagonist underscored the grimy nightmare version of Earth and ultimately complemented the deeply unsettling, borderline Cronenberg plans Zim carried out, like the episode where he replaced children's organs with household items to make himself more human. These ideas worked because of just how gonzo the entire show was, balancing kid-friendly versions of cynical satire and grindhouse fiction.
In order to be what we are, we have to come out of what we are not.
So what's scarier than just being a body? How about being more than a body? Death, purpose, and self aren't things people tend to think of when they think of horror for kids, but that's because people wildly underestimate kids in general, and you should really talk to them about these things because they might be uncomfortable asking, and Sunday school only taught me how to be afraid of burning in hell forever, Mom. Back in the day, these bigger metaphysical ideas were relegated to catalysts and undercurrents as opposed to the true focus of a given story, like in the opening of Spirited Away when Chihiro's parents are turned into pigs. It's not a very important thing, but it stays with Chihiro and informs her journey in the spirit world, especially her position as caught between it and the human world. Avatar even manages a similar dichotomy with Aang's connection to his past lives and his sense of self as the Avatar. It's a stretch to even call these elements of horror, but at their cores they're reminiscent of the greats of cosmic horror, really only missing the unholy Goliaths that tend to represent the insignificance of humanity.
To get smoked in the name of bubblegum!
For all its silly, plotless episodes and early 2000s style slang, Adventure Time knew how to turn on the scary and wasn't anywhere near as afraid to do it as its predecessors. The bizarre world of Ooh was built on an implied foundation of apocalyptic atrocity, and the iconic presence of the Lich radiated dread to a point that he sucked the life out of the scene. In a show where Death himself was a character, and a reasonably chill one at that, Ron Perlman's performance as the embodiment of malice is beyond haunting, and it doesn't stop there. Adventure Time's horror episodes took advantage of their surrealism to explore existential fears that children might not know how to cope with. Mortality, the self, the meaning of existence, the anxiety of morality. The show was packed to the brim with great cosmic terrors and entities of pure evil, but Finn was never made to deal with them outside of his own understanding of the world. He suppresses them, he hides from them, sometimes he lucks out and they solve themselves, but the scariest moments from the show are the ones that have no answers, and they hit the hardest when Finn is forced to just face them, and hope that's enough. The developing landscape of modern horror takes this style to more cynical and brutal extremes, with the likes of Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, and Alex Garland taking slower, more philosophical approaches to classic ideas. The result is a kind of horror that looms instead of lurking, and suffocates instead of pouncing. The unknown is better served as something of a setting, and Patrick McHale knew better than anyone how little an anxious kid knows. Of the dozens of pages I could write about what a masterpiece Over the Garden Wall is, this script only has room for about a paragraph or two. Its version of the unknown is a literal forest, vaguely purgatorial and bursting at the seams with ostensibly ominous but generally rather folksy weirdos, and, kind of like Adventure Time, one significantly terrifying monster called the Beast. Its purgatory angle works both ways, as everything that seems like a threat turns out to be charming, and yet the corners of the frame itch with something deeply ominous. The Beast quite literally gaslighting the lost souls of the unknown and feeding on the distress and guilt of its victims as the main characters are led further from where they want to be and start to give in to the forest's lingering sense of despair. There was a 1 in a million chance that any series made for children would ever capture the strange beauty of good folk horror, but the painstaking effort to build the atmosphere of Over the Garden Wall paid off. Rarely, if ever, will it probably actually scare a kid, but like a lot of the woefully mistitled, elevated horror of the last decade or so, it doesn't have to if it effectively uses a backbone built on horror to tell a great story. Now you may be wondering, where does Goosebumps fit in? And honestly, it kind of doesn't. Let me explain. R.L. Stine is the Stephen King of kid-friendly horror, but when you talk about his horror, the operative word is friendly. The guy wrote his stories in like a week, and if you go back and read them, you'll remember the kids in those books were hardly ever in any real danger. While they were popular, Goosebumps books operated on a very superficial level and worked more like a simplistic gateway into the world of spook. Is that an important step? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a puppet. The point is, this is an obligatory section where I acknowledge the existence of horror for babies and casually transition to the main point of children's horror, that being something even Goosebumps managed without fail over and over again. Children versus scary things. My absolute favorite scene from Into the Spider-Verse is this one, where Miles has literally just become sort of Spider-Man, and Kingpin murders Peter Parker in front of him. And then...
What was that? Kill that guy.
That's the scariest thing I've ever heard. The scenes where Miles is shown specifically to be not just in over his head, but genuinely afraid for his life are scarier than every minute of The New Mutants. And it's because they make the most of the realistic position Miles is in. He's a child hunted by professional killers, and he has no idea where to turn. The scariest part of being a kid is the complete lack of control. Every day, everywhere you go, you have no semblance of agency to grasp. You're trapped in whatever distressing situation you find yourself in. Agency is a common thread in all horror, but for kids, it's not something that's taken away from you. It's something you learn to fight for because you never have it in the first place. The basis of children's horror is to force young protagonists to fight back against their fear without the help of adults, and you can apply that to any and every story I've talked about, along with pretty much any other you think I missed. The exception is Scooby-Doo, which we will not be talking about, not only because it teaches kids that they should run from their problems until their problems stumble into half-assed Rube Goldberg traps, but also continues to convince young and impressionable minds that the one and only other character besides the protagonist turning out to be the villain is somehow a twist. You know, not that bad twist villains is a common issue in modern children's media. So let's talk about Coraline. Coraline is, in my mind, the perfect children's horror movie. It's very pure horror, and you might think I should have used it in the body horror segment because, well... But Coraline's not really about anything too specific, which is why I call it pure horror. It pulls from every aspect of horror. You can splice the body horror from the button eyes and the Bedlam's dolls, the existential dread from the parallels of the other world. You can imprint a lot of themes onto Coraline's personal journey, and that it starts and ends almost completely of her own volition is something you don't necessarily see too often from children's horror. It was adapted from a notably shorter novella by Neil Gaiman, but it didn't really add anything of narrative significance, and again, that's not a bad thing. It's a great movie, and it does what it wants to with Gaiman's building blocks. You see, I'm not here to say that children's horror has to do anything special. I'm saying it can, and should be free to try. Pure, conventional horror aimed at children is a rare thing, especially now, because more often than not, it's kind of confused and mediocre. It's a difficult balancing act, but children's horror is a very important step in both creating the next generation of horror fans and instilling an understanding of real fear and realistic courage in developing minds. Horror is so popular because it shows us a lot about ourselves, and so difficult to do well because it requires a lot of self-awareness. So the next time you walk through the crumbling shell of what used to be your local mall, give a little salute to the last of the Hot Topics. You may not realize it, but today's grungy weirdos are tomorrow's horror icons. Or something. Is Hot Topic already an outdated reference?
Burn down, Hot Topic. Don't let it steal your soul.